It's time the world learned the truth. So here's the too long don't read. A bunch of dudes with guns have occupied a visitor's center in Oregon, and they've somehow simultaneously managed to captivate the collective rage of both the conspiracy theorist right and the liberal left, both in the same time. Boom. Meanwhile, a couple of seemingly decent chaps with antiquated values from a bygone era have had trouble adjusting to the modern age and have ended up in federal prison in California. Meanwhile, there are people who belong in the headlines over this issue, and they are not urban youths of color, nor a bunch of militiamen, nor two measly ranchers, but the Paiute Indians who, one could argue, belong on that land more than anybody. Side note, I can't believe how much digging it took me to find the Aboriginal story here. I actually failed to find an Earth First article, but got on the right track when I read that the Burns tribe was instrumental in getting the EPA to clean up dangerous mercury and arsenic mining waste in McDermott, Nevada, which was being used for landscaping in people's yards. Go Burns tribe! In this situation, we have an opportunity to learn. What I am upset about is that my friends on Facebook seem more interested in driving political agendas than they are about helping teach me something new about my increasingly complex world. The situation in Malheur is complicated. Every time a big issue comes up, it seems like we jump on the issue as an opportunity to polarize people against each other. And I guess that finally fed me up. I've called people's reactions knee-jerk because a lot of people I otherwise respect seem to have instantly passed judgment on everyone involved in the Malheur occupation. I read about these people being called arsonist Nazi child abusers by people with big online followings who have never even been to Oregon. Well, I haven't been to Oregon either, so I guess I must be clearly eminently qualified to have an expert opinion on this matter. So here goes. With elections coming up, we are radically polarizing ourselves into us versus them mentalities. And right now, equality means radically different things to different people. And this country is not growing any bigger unless we decide to invade Canada. One of the biggest issues at stake here is what happens when you live in the USA and you disagree with the majority. What happens when you try to make a living in the most remote part of the country then? The situation is a test case for that. But right now, let's look at political divisiveness. Let's assume most of us don't want to hole up in a remote compound somewhere. Let's think about what our choices are when you live shoulder to shoulder with a neighbor who is threatening your way of life. For example, I'm half Jewish. What happens when a neo-Nazi moves in next door? When another human being does not believe in inequality, we have three choices. You can kill that person who does not believe in equality. You can imprison or exile that person. Or you can try to change that person's mind. The only way we are going to fix increasingly radical division within the United States is to spend time with people who are different from us and learn to respect each other. Throwing epithets, escalating violent rhetoric, and stereotyping large groups of people you've never met is not going to make this country great. Again, for the last time, or whenever. Maybe for the first time we're going to be great, I don't know. I feel like the definition of greatness is subjective, and it's changed over the years. A lot of what we have in the US of A seems pretty great to me, but I have a ton of privilege that maybe others don't have. But I think on balance, Americans appear to have way more rights and privileges than the global average, and I'm thankful for that. All I know is that if we can't even achieve the low bar of tolerance for our fellow human beings, we are never going to achieve any real form of greatness. People appear so disconnected, and I'm scared that I could see another civil war within my lifetime. So many things are so horrendously and obviously broken in this country. But I see so few people applying their minds and hands to fix the problem. Fixing things is scary, but raging against the machine is not the answer. Raging against some prison statistic is not going to fix the justice industry. Raging against the police force will not reform the police department. Raging against some dudes holed up in Oregon is not going to help them learn about the bigger issues at stake, or their followers. It's going to make them feel targeted, it's going to radicalize them, and it's going to strengthen their numbers. Is that really what you want? Conspiracy theories posted online are sufficiently well-formed that many of them are incredibly difficult to disprove. And although I might not believe 9/11 was a hoax, I do believe that Ruby Ridge happened, and I believe that Waco happened, and a whole bunch of other trampling of people's civil liberties. I believe that ranchers have been targeted by the federal government in the past, and they will be almost certainly again. When I was in California, I held in my own hands a fat folder full of blacked out Freedom of Information Act requested documents, the Department of Defense file on Students Against War in Santa Cruz, California. You can find it online. They had agents hacking into private correspondence of college kids trying to organize for peace. I saw covert surveillance reports listing names, times, known associates. A couple days later, I chatted to an undercover agent for about half an hour without ever realizing who he was. I believe that when a bomb went off in the car of Judy Berry, a leader of the environmental defense and community organizer, the FBI coordinated an effort to intentionally persecute her, casting doubt upon her character and violating her civil rights. And it's not just me that feels that way. She was posthumously awarded more than $4 million by a federal court. I believe that people deserve the truth, and the only way we can find it is if we all work together. So here's the most objective truth that I can find regarding Malheur. A group of less than 50 white men, mostly armed, took non-violent control of a wildlife refuge during the off-season. There have been reports of 12 cars visible and a couple different reports of 20 to 25 people. They claim that their actions are to call attention to federal overstepping and excess of government power. The specific flashpoint which triggered their New Year's gathering is claimed to be the resentencing of 2 local ranchers, a father who is in his 70s and his son, to 5-year federal prison terms. The 2 had already served much shorter terms for arson convictions for the prescribed burns, brush fires, that they lit over the course of a decade. It does not seem that anyone was hurt in these fires, or any man-made property was damaged. Whether or not the fires were reckless or malicious does not appear to be clear-cut. The ranchers themselves have been silent, but their lawyer did issue a statement on their behalf that they do not support the occupation. The ranchers also seem to fit a certain stereotype. The right skew them as being intelligent businessmen who are upstanding members of the community but struggle to make a living in the face of federal agencies oppressing them. The left skew that they don't respect authority, that they've got a track record of defying and ignoring federal mandates, and that they just want to live off the fat of the federal land, and that they abused their nephew by sandpapering someone's initials he had carved into his body. I want to call special attention to the nephew, not to try to frame anything as right or wrong, but just to offer context as to how incredibly fucked up the whole situation is. It seems that the boy's parents, separated, were unable to raise him or were somehow not a good enough influence that he had to live with his grandparents. So they have a problem child who bucks discipline, and it seems that they call in the boy's uncle when it gets really out of hand, when the teenager is drinking or chewing tobacco, or when he starts carving some unidentified person's initials into his own body. Ouch! And then the uncle had the kid sand the initials off with sandpaper. Ouch! Now this is totally conjecture from my life's experience, but the whole self-harm, school system calls the cops, closed case, no charges pressed against the guardians thing, raises some serious eyebrows as to whose initials those are. If the kid's grades sucked, and the uncle said, "I'm gonna torture you until your grades improve," and started sandpapering the kid's chest, well, then that would be clearly fucked up by most people's standards. But what if, and remember, this is fiction, I'm making this up, but what if he had carved a teacher's initials into his chest? What if that teacher were male? What if the teacher had him do it, and it abused his trust? Now, you're the conservative church-going uncle, a pillar of the community. You're scared. You want the whole problem to go away. You want to bury it. You want it to disappear. What do? My whole point here is that I can find perspectives in which I would empathize with the boy and also with the family. Everyone is stuck in some bad situation sometime, and some bad decisions get made. But they were the best decisions that those people knew how to make, or else they would not have made them. You need context to know when and how to step into someone else's life, and it's never our place to judge someone else's life. So now, a few years later, the feds are building a case against the uncle, and they call the kid to testify that his uncle is an arsonist. He testifies that he didn't come forward sooner because he was afraid for his life, but he's not afraid of his uncle anymore. Now, how reliable is this kid as a witness? If he grew up with all of these issues, if he was abused and neglected by his family, and now he's being pressured by the federal government, what kind of dirt might they have on him or his parents? What kind of mind games might they play? It doesn't seem impossible to me that the kid's testimony was forced or somehow distorted. The two convicted might very well be guilty. It's even likely. But after all I have learned from the trials of environmental activists like Judy Berry and Daniel McGowan, not to mention my own grandfather's Supreme Court case, I have little faith in the US government to pursue justice. They pursue convictions, and you have to be savvy enough to protect yourself. To me, a federal conviction does not equate moral guilt. As for the occupation, it seems the occupation is led by a few prominent ranchers and right-wingers who had had a similar showdown with the Bureau of Land Management, the original BLM. The BLM impounded cattle over some 7-figure back taxes in dispute. When a couple hundred ranchers on horseback faced off against a platoon or two of paramilitary-looking park rangers wearing armor and carrying assault rifles. Now, why oh why does an elite squad of commando park rangers even exist? But when they faced off, the commandos wisely backed down from the corn-fed American flag-waving men, women, and children, as opposed to shooting them. But the government's failure to act in that case certainly adds pressure to this situation. It also appears that these people who are occupying this nature preserve have a lot of support from alternative right-wing media, heavy hitters like Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist who runs InfoWars. There has been at least one claim that these people want the land they are occupying handed over to ranchers, loggers, and miners. But this is a very strange claim, since the land is really only good for ranching, even though it might have some secret mineral rights. We'll look into that later. And it was very clearly a Paiute Indian reservation 138 years ago. It appears that the federal government gave this land to the Paiute tribe legally, and then was out to get them. But of course, that's just conspiracy talk. The Paiute got into a war with some manifest destiny types, some ranchers, and it gave a great excuse for the federal government to step in and promptly quell the uprising and forced march the Indians to the Yakima Reservation in Washington. You can read about it in the history written by the Oregon Historical Society, but I'll give you an excerpt for flavor. The administration of the reservation, however, was severely hampered by a steady reduction in federal appropriations. Agent W.V. Reinhardt complained to his superiors that it is the avowed policy of the government to make the Indians self-supporting, and yet I am left without the means to make the initiatory steps for the furtherance of that policy. I ask if it is fair or reasonable to circumscribe the already limited energies of a people whom God made as free as the deer on the mountains, to curtail their natural means of subsistence by herding them upon reservations, that the dominant race may enjoy their territory, and then expect them to support themselves without any assistance. There's a link in my comments for more on the Paiute and their Trail of Tears. I encourage you to check it out. There's all kinds of weird rumors floating around. It seems that the government has tried to cut off water access to the ranchers in this area in the past, and that the ranchers impeded the construction of a fence in the process. Other ranchers seem to have had land grabs, where the government found ways to make their land not as valuable and bankrupt farms to take their land cheaply. It has also been claimed that the ranchers' management of private land attracted greater populations of certain birds than the unmolested wildlands of the refuge, suggesting that ranching on federal land might actually improve bird habitats. But then again, maybe unnatural quantities of human-cultivated crops and piles of subsidized feed are attracting the birds, which forces the refuge to plant cereal crops in an attempt to keep the birds away from attracting ire on private land. It's important to remember that this family of ranchers have been here for only 3 generations, and ranching appears to have begun in the area in the late 1800s, which was interrupted by an Indian war. And within a couple decades, the wildlife refuge was established, making it one of the oldest in the country. So it's a weird place to make such a stand. If anything, rights ought to be ceded to whatever First Nations people used to live off the land, the Paiute. Still, ranchers have faced off against the government for land use for decades.